Hi, I'm Oliver, and this is Deep Cuts, a channel dedicated to music for lovers of music. 5 albums is back, innit? It's been ages. Today, I'm going to do 5 albums to get you into post-hardcore. Post-hardcore is one of those labels that now means something entirely different to what it meant maybe 20 years ago. If you describe a contemporary band as post-hardcore, you're probably talking about bands like Pierce the Veil, A Day to Remember, Dance Gavin Dance, Falling in Reverse, Bring Me the Horizon, maybe. In that sense, it's quite a unique genre label because you can still call bands post-hardcore and be referring to the bands that I'm going to be talking about today. You can also be referring to the bands of the contemporary world who sound almost nothing like those original post-hardcore bands. So again, a very ephemeral genre label. Cards on the table, I can't stand that more contemporary brand of post-hardcore, so you won't be seeing any of those bands on the list today. The post-hardcore I'm talking about is an offshoot of the American hardcore scene growing out of the mid-80s, primarily from Washington, DC. Bands like Minor Threat and Government Issue were tearing up small venues with their supercharged, aggressive hardcore ethos, and it influenced a whole generation of musicians who wanted to make music like that but incorporate other elements, and this is where we get these bands doing post-hardcore music. As such, you get musicians that are experimenting with the kind of aggression that hardcore music has, but perhaps more melodic vocal lines, different kinds of structures, generic conventions from different kinds of music. And I think what you'll find today is that a bit like something like post-punk, the genre label post-hardcore contains within it many different kinds of styles. And I think the 5 albums I've picked today will illustrate that quite well. There are a lot of labels messily converging here. For example, a band like Captain Jazz. Do we associate them as post-hardcore, or do we include them as part of the Midwest emo scene? There are a number of bands that will straddle the line between a number of different generic markers, so there's always going to be contentious points when it comes to deciding who or what sounds like hardcore, post-hardcore music. So yeah, I'm sure we can have some arguments about that in the comments section. What I will say is throughout these 5 albums, you'll find blistering, creative music capable of delivering a hell of a punch, but also often having quite an emotive depth. Let's get cracking. Number 1, Quicksand with Slip, released in 1993. So with post-hardcore, there's often a kind of experimentation that, for lack of a better description, dismantles some of the simplicities of hardcore and rock music. And this is exactly what New York band Quicksand did with their debut album, Slip, released in 1993. Frontman Walter Schreifels cut his teeth on the NY hardcore scene in bands like Gorilla Biscuits and Youth of Today, and actually, as an aside, you should really check out Gorilla Biscuits' recording Start Today, which is a really great record. One, it's a great listen anyway, but 2, it bridges that gap between hardcore and the more melodic hardcore that was coming in, so you can start seeing that shift into the post-hardcore sound. As a post-hardcore record, Slip is pretty much perfect. It's 40 minutes of brawny tracks which marry together the aggression of heavy riffs and pummeling drums with the soaring yet rough vocals of Schreifels. The album is packed front to back with absolute bangers, which is even more frustrating when the album is often left out of discussions on post-hardcore, because it really is a great synthesis of this sound and this idea. I do feel vocally is where Slip holds a lot of its influence and its importance in this post-hardcore idea, because it's aggressive, emotive, and yet it's melodic. And this is where that shift from the quite cacophonous vocals of hardcore music moves and shifts into this idea of the post-hardcore. You have the aggression, but you also have a lot of melody there too. There's a melodic sensibility which doesn't ever upend the aggression. Alongside the vocal direction, the way that the band utilised palm-muted riffs, but also a lot of half-time grooving, especially on a track like the opening track, Phaser, just shows a couple of different stylistic techniques that they bring in to develop this post-hardcore sound. The bass-led slow burn of Unfulfilled has guitars that sound more metal-influenced than anything, and the way that Alan Cage rides that backline drum groove so well, it for me feels like a clear precursor to early Deftones material. There's definitely an influence there, there's some parallels. And interestingly, bassist Sergio Vega of Quicksand ended up being the latter stage bassist of Deftones. Interesting parallel. Title track Slip's melodic hook in the chorus sounds to me like a Sunny Day Real Estate track. That's what it reminds me of. A band who are around the same sort of time. If you listen to their album Diary, for example, that came out a year later, I believe, in 1994. Again, it's just showing that post-hardcore can have elements of emo as well, and it's kind of hard to categorize, and again it's proving that melodic sensibility of this music. The track Baphomet is one of the most combative of the entire record. No vocals as the band aggressively slam into this killer halftime groove. Closing track Transparent has the rebellious energy of hardcore, but in those smouldering guitar riffs and Walter Schreifel's impassioned vocal delivery, you feel like the musicians are very emotionally connected to this music. A stellar post-hardcore record. Number 2, Fugazi with Red Medicine, released in 1995. Okay, so those of you that know a little bit about post-hardcore will have been expecting a Fugazi record, no doubt. Being one of the most, if not the most influential post-hardcore band around, there was no way I could talk about this genre without touching on their brilliance. But you might have been expecting their 13 songs EP compilation or repeater, because these albums are now considered classic albums. They've helped both define a genre and bring Fugazi from that insular hardcore, post-hardcore scene and into the consciousness of the rest of the music world. You know, it's very hard to escape an album like Repeater. It's on numerous greatest albums of all time lists, and for good reason. It's a brilliant record. I actually remember one of the IT technicians at school when I was about 14 years old burning me a copy of Repeater onto CD and listening to it and being completely blown away by it. However, my pick today is their 4th record, Red Medicine, my personal favourite Fugazi record. Damn, this album's great. And I also wanted to highlight it because I feel like it's a good example of how post-hardcore can also meld with more experimental ideas. Something Fugazi do so well on Red Medicine. You know, this is an unpredictable listen. Singer and guitarist Ian MacKaye is single-handedly one of the most influential people in this scene. He was the frontman of Minor Threat, the classic DC hardcore band, and he also founded Discord Records, who are home to some amazing artists like Dag Nasty, Farrakhet, Rites of Spring, and Jawbox. In 1987, he formed Fugazi, taking his very anti-music industry ethos and marrying that with hardcore sounds, but also more experimental forms, dub, things like that, and creating the unique sound that is this band. Beginning of the opening track, Do You Like Me, creates a cacophony of overdriven guitars, pick scrapes, feedbacking before the track begins in earnest. The main riff is a great example of Fugazi's sound. It's sunny and almost optimistic, yet at the same time it has a mischievous dissonance to it. I bet if you listen to the infectious riff of Birthday Pony, you'll be unable to stop yourself from doing a little dance, nodding your head a little bit, because it's a fantastic bit of riff building throughout this track as Ian MacKaye's vocals are maniacally cackling and crying out. The spoken word vocals on Fell Destroyed show the Fugazi's experimental edge once again. Also really recalls to me an album like Spiderland by Slint, because they did that so well. And Dennis Lixon from the post-hardcore band Refused also did that on a couple of tracks on The Shape of Punk to Come. The dynamic ability of the band is there to hear on the intro of track By You, for example. There's a lovely clean guitar part before the whole band throws themselves into this infectious halftime groove, akin to something like one of the tracks on Quicksand's album Slip. A fantastic record and a good example of some of the more experimental sides of the post-hardcore scene. Number 3, At the Drive-In with Relationship of Command, released in 2000. This is one of those rare records that refuses to age even a minute. Somehow, in the year 2000, Omar Rodriguez Lopez and Cedric Bixler Zavala of Mars Volta fame released this post-hardcore record, and it genuinely hasn't aged a bit, and it's regularly cited as one of the greatest albums of all time. I'd be hard-pressed to disagree with that statement. At the Drive-In formed in El Paso, Texas in 1994, and they had a couple of interesting releases during this time leading up to the year 2000, like Acrobatic Tenement, In Casino Out, the Vea EP, but far and away the greatest thing they did was their 3rd LP, Relationship of Command. Like Quicksand Slip, not a single second is wasted on this LP. The energy that is harnessed through every single track, it's contagious and it bursts through your speakers. Every riff conceived by Omar and Jim Ward, every one of Tony Hajjar's fills, and Cedric's theatrical and very dramatic vocal parts. I listened to this album again a couple of weeks ago on a car journey with my good friend Matt, and neither of us could believe quite how little this album has aged. It feels as if it could be released tomorrow and it would feel just as vital and contemporary. And I think that's rare in a genre like post-hardcore. If I look back to some of the other bands around this sort of era, so Glassjaw for example, I feel like their aging process has not been graceful. The time hasn't been kind to them, and I think album like Worship and Tribute, I think that's aged quite badly. Even some of Refused's output, The Shape of Punk to Come, doesn't feel nearly as visceral as it did even 10, 15 years ago. But I guess At the Drive-In were always outliers anyway. Their songwriting was quite unique, and I don't think it's a surprise that the band grew into the Spanish-flecked proggy wizardry that is the Mars Volta, because I think there are seeds of that project in Relationship of Command, in some of that sinister lyricism that's bordering on the fantastical, like on the track like One Armed Scissor, for example. Yes, this is the campaign Slithered Entrails in the Cargo Bay. Neutered is the vastness, hallow vacuum, check the oxygen tanks. They hibernate, but have they kissed the ground? Pucker up and kiss the asphalt now. Tease this amputation, splintered larynx, it has access now. The opening track, Arc Arsenal, is one of the most immediate things in the record. Such a stellar way to open an album, and Hajar's kit work is frenetic. It's somersaulting with these prevalence of syncopated snare hits and a lot of crash cymbals, which adds to this kind of caterwauling that's happening. The middle eight of the track, Pattern Against Yuzo, is quite nuanced. I think it wins you over emotionally with the instrumentation, also Cedric's vocal delivery, and then when we return to that brilliant original riff, it makes you feel breathless. It's a breakneck album, no doubt about it. To talk about this album briefly feels like a sin because there's so many good things about it. You've got the drama of Enfilada, you have Rolodex Propaganda, which contains a surprising and exciting guest vocal from Iggy Pop. You have the slow burn of a track like Quarantined, which evokes like a rain-drenched alleyway with its backgrounded ambience. I don't imagine there'll be many people watching this that haven't heard Relationship of Command, but if you haven't, it should be put right to the top of your listen to list. I mean, it's one of the all-time great albums, definitely. Number 4, Unwound with Leaves Turn Inside You, released in 2001. I'm convinced a lot of you will discover your new favourite band or new favourite album listening to this for the first time. If you've never experienced the genius of Unwound, then you are in for a ride. Unwound were a band from Washington State, forming in 1991 and splitting up very shortly after the release of their final record, today's masterpiece in question, Leaves Turn Inside You. I remember first listening to this album and thinking, this surely must be post-rock. Certainly the first track, We Invent You, has the same kind of slow burn grandeur that is accredited to bands like Godspeed You Black Emperor, and I can even hear Ocean Size in this track. There must be some influence that Ocean Size took from Unwound, and I would always consider Ocean Size more of a post-rock act than anything else. Justin Trosper's vocals are lethargic and hazy for the most part, completely different to all of the vocal deliveries that are on the rest of the albums on this list today. As you journey deeper into the album, however, you start to hear the punchy bass lines, the angular guitar phrases, and it all starts sounding quite post-hardcore. In Unwound's Restraint, they managed to create something just as jagged and menacing as anything else on the list. A track like Look a Ghost uses rests in its guitar riff to the point where it makes the whole thing sound very complex, despite only being in a 4/4 time signature, and the skilled drumming of Sarah Lund only increases the apparent complexity of the entire track. And all these instruments together create this feeling that everything is about to slide off the side of a cliff at a moment's notice. There are some risky moments across this 75-minute double album. For example, fourth track Treachery begins with this bright synth melody and you feel like the band might lurch into some kind of synth-driven pop. I mean, they don't, but the anticipation that they might is great, and the fact that you might even be considering the fact they will just proves that the unpredictability of the sound on this record, a little bit like Fugazi's Red Medicine. The bass is absolutely phenomenal on track Off This Century. It's completely despicable and grinding, and it really propels the track towards this particularly satisfying conclusion. Unwound sound is often so restrained that it begins to feel like a dirge, not in a negative way, but the repeated riffs and the swirling effects really start to liken it to something like shoegaze in places. I'm wondering if I'm the only person that hears that. But like track Scarlet really made me feel that what Unwound are doing is not that far away from what some of the shoegaze bands of the 90s are doing, just in a slightly more aggressive capacity. And in that synthesis, we have a band that are creating on the surface post-hardcore, which has aggression in it, but also it has these expansive drone moments, and the whole thing feels a little bit more, I haven't used this word for a while, ethereal. There you go. Filled my quota for the month now. Below the Salt is hands down one of the best things this band ever did. It shows their dynamic ability by having Silence swallow this quite thin instrumentation before, out of nowhere, it swells back in and takes control of the musical scape. Is this post-hardcore? Is this post-rock? I mean, the biggest thing is that it's a really great album, and it proves the contentious label that post-hardcore is. I'd be keen to know what you guys think. Do you think this is a post-hardcore record? I mean, I do, but I think it also incorporates a lot of other elements, similar to many of the other albums on this list today, but let me know anyway. Number 5, The Fall of Troy with Doppelgänger, released in 2005. Oof, we are ending with a childhood favourite from yours truly. I think I first heard this when I was maybe 15, or I might have been 14, I'm not too sure, but it blew my socks off. I wasn't sure whether to include this record on the list today, because there are other bands that I did kind of want to talk about, like Touche Amore, La Dispute, Refused, but rather selfishly, I just wanted to talk about this record. And I also think it's a good example of post-hardcore taking a different direction. The Fall of Troy is a Washington-based band consisting of Thomas Erak on vocals and guitar, Tim Ward on bass and backing vocals, and Andrew Forsman on drums. This is unreal. So the first Fall of Troy recording, their debut album, although it's quite rough production-wise, it was recorded during a week of spring break whilst they were 17 years old. 17! Go back and listen to that earlier album, and they're creating these dense, knotty, complicated pieces of music. Specifically, the final track on that release, What Sound Does a Mastodon Make? Just listen to that and remember that 17-year-olds are making it. Wow. Second album, Doppelgänger, is really where it's at though. Released in 2005 and containing a couple of the tracks that were originally on the first album but polished up in the studio, re-recorded. One of the things I love about Doppelgänger is the complex instrumentation and songwriting coupled with that DIY production approach. It's much more polished than the debut album, but it still has that flatness to it, and that has put some people off. I've recommended this album to a lot of people, and sometimes they say, no, I couldn't get on board because of the production, which I think is a shame, but I do think that's part of its charm. I'll be interested to see what other people think about that. Let me know if you've had that with this album. Do you find Doppelgänger is just too DIY and lo-fi for you to be able to truly appreciate the musicianship? For me, it's always been a positive thing. It feels like those raggedy, batshit crazy tracks are taking on a life of their own, and Erak and co are barely being able to keep control of what's going on. Their music is more of the mathcore side of post-hardcore, so there's more erratic time signature changes, the vocals switch between melodic and screaming, the instrumental parts are furious. Opening track, I Just Got This Symphony Going, demonstrates Erak's tapping guitar technique as bass weaves around his fingerwork and Forsman's percussive onslaught begins. I can't tell you how many hours I must have spent as a kid trying to learn these parts on the drums. Pretty difficult. Doppelgänger never drops the pace, a bit like Relationship of Command really. There's not a single wasted moment here. And even on a relatively short track like You Got a Death Wish Johnny Truant, that's 2 minutes 13 seconds, so it's not a very long track, but it takes so many twists and turns, it ends up feeling longer than that. The brilliantly titled Wacko Jacko Steals the Elephant Man's Bones is probably the most razor sharp and impressive of all the tracks on this entire album, and it jumps from these squealing choruses, impassioned verses, and then starts going off on a tangent to these blazing instrumental sections. I love this album. It might not be for everybody. It's certainly worth a listen though if you want to get into post-hardcore and hear some different takes on it. And that's my 5 albums to get you into post-hardcore. I think all these albums are great. I want to know what your thoughts are. What are your favourite post-hardcore albums? What do you think of the albums I've picked? I'll be doing a listening party on the Discord on Tuesday at 10 o'clock BST for Fall of Troy's Doppelgänger, that 5th album I was talking about. I would like as many of you to join as possible because it should be a fun listen. So come and join me on that one. Thanks for watching as usual. I'll be back next week. See you then.